They understand the long-term thinking and they understand these cycles. So they're just prepared for it.
Adapt 2030 Mini Ice Age Conversations covers changes in our climate due to a new and intensifying grand solar minimum, and the media overlooking, downplaying, or burying cold weather changes occurring on our planet. This is in order to keep the global warming agenda steaming full speed ahead. I do this podcast and radio program because we need to begin conversations on how to adapt our food growing strategies long before 2030 as agricultural zones shift, affecting global crop output. But very few mainstream media outlets are talking about the most important issue of our time: cold weather crop losses. Our sun is going through a 400-year cycle, which has effects on our weather patterns as our magnetosphere weakens and the jet streams go out of flow. It's not CO2, it's not you, it's the sun. Are you ready to thrive in the grand solar minimum? Then join me for Mini Ice Age Conversations. I'm your host, David Dubine. Good afternoon, everyone. You know the calming voice when you listen to the information presented. Today, I have with me Michael Lazzaro from Evolutionary Energy Arts. You can find more about how he takes a look at the sun, the energetic changes in our bodies here on the planet, what we can do to strengthen our mind, body, and spirit moving through these changes at evolutionaryenergyarts.com. You can find him on Patreon/Evolutionary Energy Arts, where the title speaks it all. Evolutionary Energy Arts is creating videos that will educate, inform, and transform. We're coming together today to talk about the grand solar minimum as the sun goes through energetic changes, but at the same time on our Earth, you're starting to experience extremes in climate, wipeouts in entire crops that we depend on for our food sources, governments behaving strangely, posturing their pieces on the chessboard. We have the economy that's starting to unfurl in different directions, and taking steps into this new world that we're entering. It's going to require a lot of changes on our end, your end, and the way you perceive reality. So this is going to be one of the most incredible, interesting conversations that you've ever heard about it, stepping well beyond just the science, which I present a lot about in the Grand Solar Minimum on the Adapt 2030 channel. So Michael, thanks so much for joining me. In our talk before the show, we decided that we wanted to talk about the Grand Solar Minimum, how this is going to energetically affect us, how the world might move in some certain direction, and then at the end, offer some solutions and practical things people can do to get ready for these changes, and also, look for these ways to thrive during the changes, because this is the greatest opportunity in human history. And if you know where you're looking, you will have an abundant existence along with the changes that are moving forward. I know there's going to be a lot of fear during this time, and that's truly why I wanted to get you on the program. There's so many things happening, so I'm going to stop rambling and let you get in here. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me, David. It's a pleasure. And I've been a fan of yours and watching you for a number of years now, and really do enjoy your work. And you've been a blessing, most definitely.
Yeah, and I would say the same. I listened to quite a few of your videos just so I can get a more balanced and wider view, if you will, about what's going on, because I cover, the science end of it, and Christian over at Ice Age Farmer, mainly on the crop edge of it with some changes. But then here you are on the energetic side. So by coupling all these pieces together, we can get, a much, wider view of the entire spectrum of what's going on here.
Yes. And you said it right there too. It's really about, obviously we have huge change facing us, and so we have to adapt. It's exactly the thing we have to do. We have to adapt. The changes are coming. We might not be able to even have people living in some areas where people have been settled for hundreds of years. They might just have to move. We're seeing right now, the flooding of the Missouri and the Mississippi. We've seen incredible floods all around the globe, 24-hour rains equaling a year at one time. And yet at the same time, there is a bright side to things, because we're seeing the desert flower and we're seeing it bloom in some areas. So complete food production areas will be changing. Breadbaskets will be changing. Change is the name of the game right now. And to survive that, we must adapt and we must pull together. And that's one of the biggest things too. And as we had talked before about, different world scenarios and what we're seeing from politicians and how disappointing they usually are because they're still going along so much with their own typical agendas instead of really addressing the thing that is threatening the lives of so many people on this planet. We have to adapt. That is the key word.
Yeah, the food growing zones are shifting definitely. And just an FYI out there, Arkansas River all-time record floods right along with the other two that you mentioned with Missouri and Mississippi. Now, the reason I said FYI on this, 60% of global corn production is produced from China and the United States. The other 40% is through all the periphery producers, Brazil, Argentina, etc. But China is experiencing the exact same delays in planting due to too much flooding over in China. As most of you know, I live in Taiwan. I used to work in China and I still have some contacts over there. So I've been reaching out to them over the last week to see what's happening with the crop zones and planting because some of them live in the same areas. And they are telling me that rate of planting in China is so slow this year. And speaking of cycles, life and death rhythms of ancient empires, climatic cycles influence rule of dynasties, a predictable pattern of religion, war, prosperity, and debt. This book available on Amazon. The Life and Death Rhythms of Ancient Empires outlines the flow of history from 3000 BC into the Wolf Minimum, 1400 AD, identifying factors causing the rise and fall of dominant cultures, which then could be roughly forecast in terms of hundreds of years. A review of ancient history provides the basis for a glimpse into the future. This century's global temperature increases, which so excites environmentalists, can be shown to be part of a 1,000-year climate cycle. Research has shown that periods of hot and dry climate or cold and dry climate have effects on human behavior. Dominant, prosperous societies have occurred at roughly 200-year intervals, which can suggest timelines for societies into the future, enabling a forecast that the USA might lose world dominance in 2040. If you want to support this broadcast, click the link in the description box to explore more about life and death rhythms of ancient empires and climatic cycles influence rule of dynasties, and lays out succinctly where we're going in the next 20 years in terms of the grand solar minimum. And they're also having massive floods. That it's not just in the United States where we're seeing these changes. Europe's cold and wet, delayed planting there. So wherever you look around the globe, so the reason I said that is corn production is going to be drastically decreased this year. So look for massive price upswings. That's not investment advice, but I'm just saying based on the planting, because if they're planting this late in the year, the yields are going to be substantially less. And again, you know how important food is for our bodies. Like our minds don't function properly if we don't have proper nutrition.
Most definitely. Yeah, and then the quality of what we're going to be getting is probably going to be less as well. And as you've alluded to, which I enjoyed hearing in the past, is like this is the make or break time for dynasties, for countries, for politicians, for leaders. It's make or break time because, this is the type of conditions that leads to conquest, for survival, basically for survival, not necessarily out of greed, as we've seen so much in this world lately with the wars, but actually for survival, where countries are going to have to appease their citizens. If the citizens don't have food, available to them, they tend to get angry, and we can start thinking of the pitchforks in the air and the French Revolution and all these different historical events that have happened. Well, we're living in those times again, and this might actually be the most severe one. I would ask you, what are you expecting as far as the severity of this grand solar minimum? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I would ask everybody listening out there just to answer a couple of these ideas that I'll throw out here. If we go back into the 1600s with the Maunder minimum, and we go back into, say, circa 1413, late 1300s, 1400s, spore, and we got the Wolf minimum, the Ort minimum around 800 AD. Now, people were very much more self-sufficient back then and knew how to repair, how to grow food, how to, cure meat themselves. They knew how to hunt. keep, tan hides so they could use the skin for clothing. They knew how to make their own clothing. There was a lot of things they knew how to do, canning, preserving food. I mean, these skill sets are mostly lost. And blacksmithing, another one. I mean, how many blacksmiths do you know that could repair tools or plows or whatever? How many people you know how to yoke up horses to be able to plow fields? How many you know how to breed horses? These are the kind of things that if we need to go back to a pioneering lifestyle, these skill sets have been so lost. So I don't know how many people would actually be able to make it through personally on just skill sets. And then secondly, the mind frame of it all. Like how many people won't mentally be able to handle the changes like this if all their electronic devices are not working because everything's too expensive and services cease to exist? How will people mentally handle that? So if you can just go with those two basic premise before we even talk about population numbers being at almost 8 billion, when all these prior grand solar minimums, there were only about 1 billion people or less, depending on how far we go back in history. Because if we go back to 800 AD, you're only looking at around 600 million people globally. When we step up into the modern minimum, you're looking closer to 750 or 800 million people. But now we literally have 10 times that many people on the planet. So I'll leave that statement right there at the end. So what do you think? I mean, without the necessary skill sets, what would be the number one skill set for somebody to learn right now to be able to take action?
Well, how to grow your own food is going to be definitely one, but I think even more than that, well, that is up there. That's definitely one of the main things. You got to be able to feed yourself and your family. Also shelter, and also there's so many things involved here. For one, I would not feel so good being in a huge city, honestly, in these times. And if you're somebody that's always been an urbanite, boy, it's going to be challenging. It's going to be seriously challenging. And that's part of my own personal journey of, growing up in the suburbs to, moving to South Carolina about 12 years ago and, having a good garden and starting to, live a little bit more of a self-sufficient life. And now, I'm here in the Appalachian and, unfortunately, it's not going to be, well, or fortunately, it's not going to be my permanent spot because my intuition has always guided me west. And I'm going to be following that. And basically, I'm looking for land right now. I'm looking at, different plots that would be decent size, hopefully 20 to 40 acres. And I'm actually going to do what I've always planned on doing, which is creating a community of like-minded people. And so earthbag homes, because I think they're going to be the strongest and sturdiest ones to resist, pretty much anything. There's been studies that show they're the most earthquake resistant, wind resistant. And then also it's an electrical issue. It's plasma related, as we're seeing with the magnetosphere decline. The lightning, is just getting more intense. Everything is getting more intense. So, this is part of my plan is to try to get into a very rural area. And this is basically where I am now. I would have considered in the past, boy, I'm out there in the boonies. But to me, it's at this point in time, not rural enough, really. And I also have become very, very accustomed to just being around wildlife and nature and not having a lot of noise and things like that. So it's a little bit of a personal preference as well. But yeah, getting self-sufficient is definitely a key. Being able to live off grid, being in a zone where you're not going to freeze to death if you, lose power, and have a way of making sure you have backup heating, backup electricity, all that. There's so much prepping to be done. And really, you could store up food last for years. But at some point, if this is going to be a cycle that lasts like 300 years or more, like some are saying, then ultimately we're going to really have to seriously adapt and be able to be self-supporting completely. When we saw the government stats that say that they'd expect 90% of the population in the US to actually perish if we were to lose the grid, for a prolonged period of time, that's really a big statement, don't you think?
I do, and I saw one of your videos as well on your channel talking about homeland security and the DHS suggesting citizens of the US to store food for 6 months to get ready for a grid down situation. If you have that much food for 6 months for a full family, A, you would be able to get through that at least until some sort of help were to come back. But if it's an all-encompassing event, remember that's going to be years before anything comes to you in terms of help. Because if we're looking at the New Madrid Fault Zone and John Casey's amazingly well done book with his team of researchers about earthquakes on the New Madrid Fault Zone, bridges would go down, pipelines would be ruptured, and the pipelines would be everything from natural gas to water to heating oil to gasoline, and everything would instantly stop. So even if you weren't affected by the quake directly way up in New York, all of your fuel would instantly dry up. Literally within minutes, it would be disrupted. So staying off grid and being more self-sufficient, and if we do look back in history, you can see that in the 1600s in the Maunder Minimum, they started to experience these changes. But here's another difference. Like the lead into the Maunder Minimum, that took 3 full solar cycles. So people were getting adjusted more to, hey, the weather's a little stranger this year. Hey, the weather's a little stranger this year. So it took about 40 years to drop into the coolest part for them. But for us, we're going into it in 1 solar cycle. It's already begun. You can feel the changes energetically. TrueLeafMarket.com. I really want to talk about growing your own food, which will be a necessity moving forward. There's so many ways that we can go about growing different types of vegetables that we're going to need. You know, microgreens are incredibly nutritious. They're super fast to grow. In less than a week, you can have something that you can eat. Also, sprouts. We can get those a little bit taller, a little more dense, a little bit larger volume on the vegetation mass coming off of there. So how do you know what kind of sprouts to grow? How about wheatgrass or herbs? What about different types of herbs that we can add to our foods? Now, what I just described to you, there's a full range of starter guides there at TrueLeafMarket.com for you to take a look at. Even if it's just for your own knowledge and you don't purchase something from them, at least get the information so you know how to grow microgreens, you know how to grow sprouts, you understand what some of the herbs are for. TrueLeafMarket.com. Use the link below and give yourself the gift of organic and heirloom seeds. You know what's happening electrically in the atmosphere, but we're going to drop straight into this. And when I say into the coolest part for this first, and we're talking about this particular 2 sets of solar cycles here, 2023 to 2024 is going to hit that first cool period, and then we're going to bottom there. And it's going to stay bottomed through 2032 approximately. And then we're going to start to come out of that a little bit. So maybe there'll be better food production. But looking back in history as well, food prices through Central Europe, you have to go back into, let's say, 1700 to 1720, and then they had a different data set from 1640 to 1700. There were incredibly bad harvest years. Like we're experiencing one of these now. So I would, march back in history and go, all right, this is going to be a bad harvest year for corn. So what they would see, the prices would rise anywhere from 3x to 7x up on particular products. But back then it was wheat and barley were the main 2 consumables of the day, not so much corn. But then in good years, the prices would drop right back down to where they would be at the normal start point, back down to 1x or, like the baseline. So it's not going to be up indefinitely with the food prices into infinity. It's going to pull back when they have good harvest years. But in that interim, Homeland Security telling you to get ready for 6 months of food. I would also say like years worth of seed inside that pack. And water, you're going to have to know how to filter water and be able to purify that water.
Most definitely. And all those things are very, very challenging when you're going to have such disruption going on. And it's just so disheartening what we're seeing across the country. I cover a lot of the stuff that's going on with, we have so much of a mass die-off going on right now. We're literally in a huge mass extinction. And it's really very, very disgusting to see the pollution, the runoff, the chemicals. We had in Florida, we had the red tide. They also had the green algae, which was mostly just done by runoff from companies. And you see such a loss of life. And the red tide is something that's a natural phenomenon, but the green algae was definitely a man-made event. And then, of course, we have Fukushima, and how bad is that actually with poisoning the ocean? We really don't know. But I mean, we have whales beaching up, and they're just totally emaciated in San Francisco. Dolphins and all sorts of sea life all over. It's just such a mass die-off. Really, so much of it is caused by poor business decisions. It really, really is. It's just disgusting, the corporate greed. And as we were talking about before, with the leadership of this world, just still going along with their agendas while we have this mass die-off and these huge uh, earth change earth change challenges going on, and facing this situation where the whole crop production zones are changing. And then you see the political posturing, and we do see that some countries are perhaps already very, very well set up and have things planned out way ahead of other ones. And take China, for instance. We were talking about the ghost cities and wondering what those are for. And so many of them are over there in the desert. And but they understand the long-term thinking, and they understand these cycles. So they're just prepared for it, in my opinion. And they're also making inroads, obviously, in Africa and South America with making loans that other countries are already having a hard time repaying. And so, that will lead to more basically resources for that particular country. And other countries seem to be oblivious to what's happening, at least on the surface.
Or they pretend to be oblivious, because I know China has also earmarked invasion into Myanmar, or formerly known as Burma, because down there, if you're unaware of what's happening in Burma, or Myanmar, the current name for the place, it's the old name that was the English named it Burma, but the original name was Myanmar. That's been used for time immemorial, so they renamed it back to the original name again. Only half their arable land is being used, and if you go back to the 1960s, Myanmar was the breadbasket of Asia. It produced more rice than any country in Asia. So China's right on that border next door. That big giant port up there called Jiapu. It's right next to Sittwe. Those two giant ports are the end of the string of pearls overseas that come from Africa, where the new grow zones are going to be in northern Africa, that are going to transport that food back to China. And again, you talked about the loans. Well, they got the Sri Lankan port. Now they got the Maldives, that they've already acquired one port because they couldn't pay anything back. They got the fishing rights out of the Maldives as well. And everywhere you look along, and Gwadar over in Pakistan, and you start to take a look at all these jump off points all the way from northern Africa and the Sahel over to Jiapu and Sittwe ports over in western Myanmar, and then it's only 120 miles over into Yunnan province, and then they can take that by rail. So they've actually developed everything, oil pipelines, so they don't have to go through the Straits of Malacca. They developed all the rail lines for Myanmar because they were too impoverished to do so. So they set up the most state-of-the-art rail system and oil pipeline delivery system back to China from western Myanmar. Now, these are the political maneuvers that have been going on since, say, 2012. And then the investments in northern Africa, if you take a look at the old Roman grain growing areas, so we got to go back 2,000 years. So that's why I'm more in confident saying that we're rolling back into at least the minimum of 2,000-year weather cycle here, climate cycle. Because if you go back and look at the Roman grain growing areas, you start to see Algeria and that whole northern Africa, Tunisia. That was the grain growing area for Rome at the time, parts of Morocco, Libya. And now that has been bone dry forever. But now the rains are coming back. And now we're starting to see really why China's there.
Yeah, they think long term, and that's what you need to do. So they've had this plan implemented, and they're going to be in pretty good shape. Of course, they're also growing militarily, but still, the United States spends 3 times as much. And I just don't see where the leadership in the U.S. has really done anything. And maybe things that I don't. You probably do, regarding protecting well, obviously they're acquiring oil everywhere. For the corporate interest there, at least that's what I tend to view it as. But as far as like the food growing areas, now perhaps there's stuff going on that we don't see either. And as I've quoted before, there were stats that showed that the U.S. was in 90% of the countries of the world militarily with a military presence in 2017. So there might be more of a chess game going on as far as, for control of the food resources too, on our side too, on the U.S. side.
Yeah, because China has these massive records going back some 5,500 years of climate cycles. So obviously they know. And also, you think Ukraine was just an accident over there? Again, look at Ukraine. Forget about the politics, but look at Ukraine. It is the breadbasket in Central Asia there.
Hmm.
So that's a direct fingerprint in the U.S. politics meddling right in there, and that's the biggest grain growing region inside Central Asia or inside Central Europe there. I should say more Eastern Europe, but we get into Central Caucasus and going into Central Asia. That's it. You got Kazakhstan, but China just bought all the production from Kazakhstan. Like, there's not even going to be a single grain of anything coming to any other country. China went in and pretty much paid cash forward for the next 20 years for Kazakhstan's wheat production. And then we got, the Ukraine there. So you can see it happening everywhere.
You can, and you see the battle between the dollar and the yuan, and that's been going on for a while, and it's been interesting to watch it, because everything was pitted to the petrodollar, and now you have basically options, and a lot of countries are seeing that there's options. Now we actually have two choices instead of one choice, and you see countries like the Philippines flopping back and forth, and others as well. So it's really interesting to watch all the maneuvering going on right now, pre-positioning.
Yeah, and I want to throw kind of a wild card out here if I could. The Indus Valley. And I don't know if those of you are fans of history. If we go back to the Indus Valley, that's one of the cradles of civilization. We got, the Tigris River in Sumeria, and then we got the Indus Valley. Now, the Indus Valley's been drying out for thousands of years, and, Pakistan, Afghanistan, really dry. And then we got Iran, which has been incredibly dry as well. But we look at the rainfall patterns for the last 5 years. Now in Afghanistan, we got rivers running next to the abandoned ruins that were abandoned 2,000, 3,000 years prior because of lack of water. Is that new food growing zones that they said they're going in there militarily for the gas, the oil, the terrorism? But in reality, the next layer of the onion is those are going to be new food grow zones as well. That'll be totally controlled. Marching back through history, go back into the cradles of civilization. Like, they weren't cradles of civilization because they had bad growing conditions. It was the most optimal growth conditions to keep the human species alive so they could proliferate from that point. And we're back there again, scarfing up land militarily. I don't know, maybe that's just too much of a wild card for Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. But why all the saber rattling now? Look at all the desert flooding in Iran. That's a massive, massive, gigantic, huge, gigundous grow zone that would come online.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great idea, and that's exactly another layer. Maybe that's the deepest layer.
Yeah, it's possible because the layering's out there for sure.
Yeah, that would definitely be one I didn't see coming before. And as so many, I saw it coming. If you're familiar with Project for a New American Century, it was all laid out. The need to control the resources. And of course, they were talking more in that document about oil and the like. But hey, food is a commodity, it's a resource, and you can't feed an army without it. That's for sure.
This video is brought to you by our friends at TrueLeafMarket.com. Heirloom and organic seeds for any grow zone on our planet.